items. Thank you all again for making it out to join us today as we kind of recap and take a look at a lot of the industry trends when it came to data protection from this year in 2019. It certainly was an interesting one and a lot of new challenges, I think, for folks as well. But now, before we begin, all attendees were placed into listen-only mode, so a number of folks are chatting in hello into the Q&A and the chat boxes. Please do continue to use that functionality throughout the presentation. If you're trying to talk to us through your phone, we are unable to hear you, but we do have some time reserved at the end of today's presentation for any questions that come in during the session. Also, this session is being recorded, and a link for playback will be made available to all attendees following the conclusion of today's presentation. And lastly, as the name states, this is one of our $500 technical demonstrations. So all of our attendees today have been entered into a raffle. Once we get that final report from WebEx, we will be entering all of our attendees into a raffle. We have 5 $100 Amazon e-card prizes, so please do keep an eye out for those prizes and for word through your email if you are one of our lucky winners. This webinar, if you have received invitations, is also the first of a 2-part series. So again, today was a compilation of industry research, Unitrends survey research, and otherwise to kind of capture overall trends and themes. Next week, when we kind of dive a little bit deeper into each of these kind of trends, going to talk much more specifically about the Unitrends solution and how we are arming our customers and helping them to prepare for the strategies and solutions of tomorrow. So absolutely would encourage folks to keep tabs on unitrends.com/events for that upcoming session. Again, going to be a little bit more prescriptive with regards to Unitrends. Today we're going to look at some of the larger trends and results industry-wide here. Before we do jump into the findings here, just want to take a moment and introduce Unitrends for folks that are maybe just joining us for the first time, or if you haven't heard or aren't overly familiar with Unitrends. We've actually been in this space for a while. We celebrated our 30th anniversary earlier this year, originally founded in 1989 by Dr. Steve Schwartz, helping a lot of customers throughout the healthcare and medical field protect their Unix systems in the late 80s. So that's where the Uni in Unitrends comes from. But throughout the evolution of our company and our product, now today more than 30,000 customers across the globe trust Unitrends for their data protection and disaster recovery needs. With a combination of our hardware and software solutions, we're helping those customers protect a combined 2 exabytes of data. And with the Unitrends Cloud, a purpose-built, manufacturers-operated data center hosting solution, you can see roughly the locations of those global data centers on the map there. We are protecting over 100 petabytes of customer data with the Unitrends Cloud specifically. This all-in-one approach, protecting local systems, hardware, software, supporting cloud as well, has led to a very happy and a very unified customer experience. Our folks maintain a 98% customer satisfaction rating. A huge tribute to our customer support folks that are still out of Columbia, South Carolina. So all Unitrends support, whether you're calling with regards to an issue for backup, restore, hardware, software, or cloud, you're reaching that same organization in a US-based Unitrends support engineer, 24/7/365. Down at the bottom there, you can see just a couple of the Stevie Awards that we have won and taken home year over year for our customer support and service organization. Again, they do an absolutely fantastic job supporting all of our users. Now, when it comes to the survey, the majority of results here are going to be driven from the Unitrends Cloud Survey, and this is a survey that our marketing organization has put out now for the 5th straight year, beginning back in 2014. We polled respondents between May and June, so about the halfway mark here through this year. There was a mix of different industry verticals, as you can see, a number of different customer sizes, but a solid 425 respondents. We're usually in the 400 to 800 respondent range, and I think it's important to note that these are not just Unitrends customers, so we're not just speaking to our users, but folks that have come across us in the community, leveraging third parties such as Spiceworks or Redmond Magazine. You may have seen links to take polls there. So this does represent customers of Unitrends and elsewhere across a number of different industry verticals and organizations of varying sizes. The majority of respondents, as it relates to the Unitrends survey, were based in the US. 90% of our respondents based here in the United States. But when we look at the state of overall backup and recovery, a certain challenge still remains, and for as advanced and sophisticated as some of our technology has become today, there has not been a significant change in the number of organizations that are reporting data loss as a result of an outage over the last 4 or so years. We're certainly seeing data live in increasingly distributed locations, whether that be at a secondary site. We've got increasing users that are remote or mobile that are producing data and critical IP on endpoint devices, PCs, and those aren't necessarily always being backed up. A third-party survey that I had come across with had revealed that due to a number of different limitations, about 11% of data in the data center is still going without adequate backup and protection. But that's even worse for remote offices, branch locations, and mobile workers, where an average of 15% of their data goes without protection. I think that it's still staggering, and the words from our product marketing manager, really an unacceptably high amount of data loss is still very much a trend today. We're seeing, again, increasing challenges and certain limitations from an IT side. Coupling with data loss is that downtime, unplanned or system downtime. Typically, you might be thinking of things like a ransomware attack or a natural disaster, such as a fire or a flood. Really, those headline-grabbing incidents, while those are certainly a reality and represent some of the most severe events we have to respond to, the majority of data loss incidents are due to us as people. Accidental deletion, errors in the server room, errors applying a software patch, compatibility issues between hardware and software. We still see that unplanned system downtime claiming productivity and ultimately revenue off of the bottom line for organizations. And again, some of those challenges are increasing complexity of overall infrastructure. We're seeing a tremendous shift in the emphasis that's being placed on application availability, but not necessarily a correlating investment in hardware or people or processes to help support those overall initiatives. And we also talked about remote workers. Ultimately, we would sum this up in that IT professionals are really facing a less is more world in which you're being tasked with more projects, work, and risk than ever before, while also kind of being provided less resources, funding, and headcount with which to be able to accomplish these. And for Paula, who just chatted in, this session is being recorded. But when we look at the overall cost of downtime, Ponemon Institute, in correlation with Gartner, conducted a study, and they estimate that the average instance of unplanned system downtime runs an organization about $9,000 per minute. And we're taking into account here certainly the lost revenue from the organization, but that's not the only factor here. When critical systems or applications are made unavailable, we also suffer impacts to employee productivity, where they can't use the tools that they need to accomplish their day-to-day functions. All of a sudden, they're falling behind. I look at Unitrends, for example, and our sales function. If they ever lost access to our Salesforce or our phone systems, their operations would be absolutely hamstrung. Depending on the incident that we are recovering to, we also have the cost that's being associated with that recovery. Do we need to invest in new equipment, new software, third-party services, consultants here? And then that intangible cost, kind of the last piece that's taken into the equation, is that if our organization suffers an outage or a breach and we're in the headlines for the wrong reasons, do we risk losing current customers or prospective customers to our competitors due to an unperceived or an oversight, if you will? There was also some research here from Carnegie Mellon University on the impacts of that outage and what distractions cost users. Interruptions cost the IT professional an average of 31 hours per week. Take that, your standard, well, maybe not standard for folks anymore, your 80-hour work week, almost 50% being lost due to interruptions, folks coming in, hey, I lost a folder, I can't log in, just little things that pop up from here to there. The impact as well, when we talk about that productivity figure, was they found some really fascinating research on what happens to the human brain upon interruption. And across their studies, it found that it took an average of 25 minutes to return to that same level of cognitive processing from before the interruption, and upon interruption, that cognitive processing drops by almost 20%. So upon being interrupted, whether it's a minor error or a major issue, all of a sudden you've gone from an A to a C+ student in that instance, and you may be responding to something that's absolutely critical or really could threaten business operations or the overall continuity of the business. So we're taking into account a lot of different factors here. A lot of times when we say that $9,000 per hour, folks think, hey, that's way too high for my organization, but when you take into account all of the factors here, it starts to make a little bit more sense and be a little bit more palatable, I think, for folks when they look at some of the other criteria. Ultimately, and some findings from Dell EMC kind of echo this, but the loss of data itself versus that unplanned downtime is nearly twice as detrimental. Dell's findings were that unplanned system downtime ran around that same cost. They came to a findings of about $527,000 per hour, but the loss of critical data or IP was almost 200% more, an average of $996,000 per hour. So we really need to not only avoid that unplanned downtime, but also find ways to preserve that data from accidental deletion, external threats such as ransomware, malicious hackers, and so forth, because the value that we're placing on our data today to drive insights, analytics, market segmentation, proactively responding to customers, and so much more has become absolutely mission critical, and for a lot of organizations is their second most valuable asset behind their people or their employees. When we look at data being lost and downtime being suffered, in some cases, is that due to inadequate recovery testing where a restore has failed or a restore is not planned or not going as expected? I think that across the board organizations underestimate the importance of recovery testing. The majority of our respondents, about 55%, are testing once a year or not at all. While there has been a little bit of improvement, I think that there's still a challenge here when it comes to testing, and the biggest hurdle is that testing takes resources. Unless you've adopted a backup solution with the ability to automate that testing, like a Unitrends, you're going to need to come up with both personnel and computing resources to complete testing. You may need separate hardware or a spin-up lab. You're not going to want to typically use that production environment as you're adding in a heavy risk and diverting resources from business operations. So we've got our independent or dedicated testing hardware. Now we need to assign an employee to run tests, to validate the results, and we're adding up or accumulating this financial investment that necessarily isn't going to impact the bottom line. Additionally, you need to have a plan. Testing for success from DR plans that are out of date, it's a losing proposition for those folks that are testing, once a year. Does your environment or even some of the software versions, patches that have applied in maybe February still hold true? Do things look the same in October or November? Can you really know what you're looking at for recovery 6 months after a test has been run with all the different changes and implementations that may change? But when we do want to test and ensure that backups are successful, it's going to go beyond, for a lot of folks, or we want to go beyond that screenshot verification. We want to validate individual file recovery or validate that data, the ability to boot a machine, mount a database, coordinate the spin-up of multiple machines or end-tier applications, even running application tests post-boot to ensure that services are on and responding, a SQL query is producing a successful output, and we're able to meet the recovery point and the recovery time objectives. There's a testing paper on the unitrends.com website that I would encourage folks to check out, and for next week's session as well, going to delve a lot deeper in Unitrends' ability to automate that testing. The last piece here that was really critical in 2019 was ransomware, and when I came on board with Unitrends about 3 years ago, it was something that we were just starting to talk about, but whether we were talking to our current customers, prospective customers, or even some of our manufacturer and our reseller partners, 3 years ago, it wasn't a threat. Well, it was a credible threat. It wasn't something that was really sticking. A lot of folks thought it would be a flash in the pan. This year alone, We saw some significant attacks, a $600,000 ransom paid down in Riviera Beach in Florida. Texas attacks that were hit through their MSP impacted 23 municipalities simultaneously. These threats are significant, and ransomware really is one that's here to stay. In a lot of cases, you're falling into two groups. You're an organization that has already dealt with a ransomware attack, or you're an organization that is preparing to deal with an impending attack. But from Sophos, some studies that they had from their threat report this year, the average cost of a ransomware attack on businesses was about $133,000. But I think that that's a number that's really tough to glean from. You could take, for example, a number of Unitrends customers that were able to recover in under a day, in some cases in under 15 minutes from a ransomware attack, and had minimal impact to their organization. You could look at the city of Atlanta, that Florida municipality down in Riviera Beach that were paying that were dealing with damages in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. So it really does span a spectrum, but we've seen ransomware attacks increased by almost 100% in the last 2 years, nearly doubling in frequency, and they're finding new ways to go after users, looking for the ability to really automate or have these infections run autonomously, phishing emails, preying on unknowing administrators to click on a bad link or a malicious attachment. The use of drive-by advertising or malvertising have been increasing in prevalence. A little bit over a third of organizations that were struck by malware have taken a week or more to regain access to their data. A new organization this year fell victim to a ransomware attack every 14 seconds, and again, they're expecting this only to increase. One of the main culprits, I think, in tracking down or being able to source some of these attacks, as an example on the right here, that Gand Crab, ransomware as a service, is one that we really want to call out because it's making it increasingly difficult to source the origin of these attacks and these threat actors. For a one-time fee or for a small split of any ransoms collected, you can, through a Onion site or a Tor site, find access to ransomware kits in which you would be able to buy the kit, start to spread infection, and then you're just paying back the developer, but you're receiving from them regular support, regular code updates to keep up to date with the latest and greatest from their sides. Elsewhere across the landscape, we've seen attacks growing increasingly sophisticated, either targeting specific industry verticals, attempting to disable backups, antivirus, really trying to close loopholes, avoid detection. Ransomware in a lot of cases is not all that different from other phishing attacks or threats where they want to remain undetected on the network for a certain period of time so that they can steal as much personally identifiable information as possible. Only once they've extracted that information and attempted to close those loopholes do they hit you with that splash screen demanding ransom. So once you've seen that splash screen, there's a good bet that threat actors have been inside your organization from anywhere to 30, 60 to 90 plus days. It really has become a challenge. The FBI as well is mentioning that, really prevention and being proactive is going to be your best defense, really leveraging backup. You're not going to replace your anomalous threat detection, spam filters, antivirus monitoring, but they really do recommend that backups are the most surefire way to be able to recover critical data. This year we have seen changes in how vendors, specifically from a backup perspective, are arming their customers to fight against ransomware. We certainly have the ability to protect the environment. Again, firewall, antivirus, those endpoint or that endpoint and network protection. But from within, a lot of vendors are developing backup or architecting their solutions in which they are preventing backup repositories from being infected. These are much more advanced than a shared Windows share in which you're dumping backup files, but by leveraging something like a purpose-built Linux platform, for example, you're able to have a little bit more flexibility in how you're architecting out and building out those storage partitions. The biggest attribute that backup vendors are leveraging today is immutable storage, and that it is read-only. So you have the benefit of having read-only backup files that are being stored within a Linux partition. Ransomware, is majority The majority of ransomware is Windows binary. That's your largest addressable install base as far as operating systems. That's where they can infect the most clients and cause the most damage. That's not to say that we haven't seen variants that have gone after Mac OS or Linux variants, but they're significantly fewer and further between. If Windows binary were to be backed up and land in that repository, it's unable to execute against read-only file extensions, and it's unable to execute against Linux-based files. Typically, they're using Windows executables or PowerShell scripts targeting the Windows command line interface, not writing that code to go after Linux. Unitrends is built in this way, and in our 30 years of doing business, we have never had a backup appliance lost or compromised due to ransomware. The other piece is arming you on the front end with predictive analytics and starting to leverage advancements in AI and machine learning. With Unitrends, we're running a scan against every backup file that your appliance is creating and monitoring every asset across your network and establishing baseline patterns of behavior. We're looking at things like typical rates of change, the overall entropy or the randomness of the data, density of the data, even levels of encryption. When threat conditions are detected, potentially identifying a ransomware attack, that alert is pushed out through our UI dashboard, our trap notifications, email alerting, to alert you to machines that are behaving anomalously. This gives our users visibility into the production environment for changes or unexpected behavior that they can investigate, take the right steps to quarantine machines, disconnect them from the network, and start to wipe them and plan for restore. The last piece, and having confidence in a clean, usable point of recovery, is through that fully tested and verified backup, which you can automate with Unitrends with our recovery assurance testing. Xscale Engineering is just one example of a customer that was able to get out of such an attack before leveraging Unitrends. They were writing backups from Exchange, SQL, their ERP applications, the file server, to LTO tapes that they rotated and took off-site. Now, these folks are based just outside of Toronto, Canada, and as their enterprise was continuing to grow, it took longer and longer to complete a full, almost 72 hours to write a full backup of that file server to those tape drives. So they were looking for ways to do things a lot faster and have more visibility into their processes. They ended up replacing the tape library and some of that legacy equipment with a purpose-built recovery appliance from Unitrends. They still wanted to have an air-gapped copy off-site, so they opted to transition from tape to rotating disks that they could take off-site, but they were also replicating to the Unitrends cloud, which they maintained as their warm DR site, by enrolling mission-critical machines in disaster recovery as a service. About 6 months after deploying the Unitrends solution, these folks were hit with a crypto virus that propagated to that main file server serving the manufacturing floor. Alerted to anomalous changes, they were able to quarantine that machine, wipe it, and identify a clean full backup to restore that server and over 2 million unique files in just under 18 hours. So they were back up and running in just about a business day following detection of that attack. Really helped them out of a potentially dangerous and compromising situation. Just one example in their case study, Xscale Engineering, you can find on unitrends.com if you'd like to read a little bit more about their experience. But the cloud is something new, and we're seeing an uptick use across the board in cloud usage, especially when it comes to DR and disaster recovery. Studies from IDG indicate that orgs are most likely to have already migrated to the cloud today. Websites and web applications for hosting, collaboration and communication, and storage, archive, and backup. Cheap and deep storage, very, very popular. You can rent a bucket or subscribe to a bucket in Amazon S3 and eliminate the use of third-party services, rotational media, and so forth. Really some effective cost savings when it comes to leveraging cloud for storage, archive, and backup. But along that same theme, for organizations that are planning to migrate certain services or use cases to the cloud, disaster recovery or having a high availability system available to them is another key use case here that's top for planning in the next 12 months here, so something that folks are planning for in 2020. or that have planned for migration, and for planning for migration into 2020, disaster recovery, again, leading the charge. And there are a number of advantages here. We're going to take a look at those a little bit more closely. But from the Unitrends Cloud survey as well, we've seen a steady decline of users that are leveraging direct-to-tape or disk-to-tape strategies, and a tremendous growth in customers that are relying on disk or even disk-to-cloud to secure those off-site backup copies, two of the fastest growing categories from the Unitrends Cloud survey over the last 3 years. We've seen as well similar results. Our results jive with that industry research, and about a 25% jump in the organizations that are leveraging cloud for backup recovery or archiving today. Again, it's becoming a standard part of backup and business continuity programs. Now, leading providers here are still public cloud infrastructures, AWS, Azure, and Google or GCP, making up 3 of the top 5. A private cloud or a co-location still very popular, but in a lot of cases, that's going to still have more of a burden on your organization from a manpower standpoint. The lease on that equipment, the power and cooling costs associated, and so forth. So I'm sure it's come as no surprise that the major public cloud providers are your leaders today in providing that DR infrastructure. Now, for users that are planning or are not using the cloud today, they are planning to adopt cloud with much greater frequency this year than they had in 2017. If what has been indicated to us will hold, less than 20% of organizations by 2020 will not be using the cloud for some portion of their data protection. We do again see organizations that are rapidly accelerating their timeline to deploy cloud-based solutions in the next 6 to 12 months here. Over 50% of our responders looking to implement cloud services over that period or over the next year. And again, advantages to that cloud. As folks know, it's on-demand and fully self-service. So when you need access to the data, you have it at any time. You're not driving up to a secondary site or 6 hours north to our DR colo, calling up our third-party provider to pull a tape from last month here. You've got access to that infrastructure again in a self-service fashion. There's the advantage as well where objections have been primarily around cost, security. You can start small and only be charged for that use. Again, for example, archiving data into Azure Blob Storage or just getting started with AWS S3. Before joining Unitrends, I worked for a large manufacturer reseller and was working with private universities throughout the Northeast. And one of the more forward-thinking of those, even back in 2015, was looking into Azure. They were a huge Microsoft shop and was looking at Azure and to the benefits that they could provide. But with some of the uncertainty, even at that time, around public cloud, they opted to start small and were just starting to move archives to that blob storage to kind of get a feel for the service and overall what that platform would be like to use it. But high availability is a key here when it comes to cloud data centers, and it's a strategic design that ensures redundancy and helps support organizations that are relying on mission-critical applications. The design, in approaching this design, is taking into account the sum of all parts, including the application workloads themselves, hardware that it's being run on, power infrastructure, and the networking behind that hardware. This high availability infrastructure reduces the risk of lost revenue and customers in the event of connectivity or power loss issues. Because of that redundancy, you can also perform maintenance without any downtime, and the failure of a single firewall, switch, or PDU is not going to affect availability. There have been reports that with high availability designs, a lot of organizations are able to push their service availability goals into that 5 nines of availability. That is, uptime will be 99.999% of the time, meaning that they would have less than 5.5 minutes of downtime per year, really tightening up that window. The redundancy here is also another factor to consider when it comes to disaster recovery data center design. A fully redundant data center It can fail over automatically to ensure server uptime in the event that a provider or the local site is experiencing issues. With this redundant infrastructure, you've got multiple ISPs that are being routed through fully redundant networks, and the ability, again, to automate that failover. UPS equipment, pooled batteries, and generators also ensure that a backup source of power is available in the event that one source or provider fails. Ultimately, your providers are going to grant you or give you an SLA detailing all of this, but it's important to ask what measures are in place for redundancy. What are you providing as that service provider, and what do we need to be considering as a subscriber to your service? But high availability and geo-redundancy, two of the main reasons cited for folks leveraging or starting to adopt to cloud. The last piece that I wanted to touch on is that compliance, and with an increasing number of industry mandates that are driving compliances, you want to be asking your cloud provider what certifications or standards they are upholding. And a couple of the major ones are the SSA 18, measuring controls and processes related to financial record keeping, the SOC 2 audit, which is most closely related to reporting on security, availability, and the privacy of the hosting or the offsite environment. Certainly HIPAA for organizations that are dealing with healthcare or any medical data. It's a regulatory or a federal mandate, excuse me, to protect that data, ensuring that the provider has undergone independent HIPAA audits of their facilities and processes to ensure security of the data, and PCI compliance as well, designed to protect credit card holder information or data for anyone that's conducting e-commerce, retail, operating franchises or things like that, where you're collecting and dealing with credit card payments. Some of the compliancy standards you want to ask about when evaluating or looking at particular cloud providers. When we look at specific use for data protection, there have been a myriad of use cases, and again, as I've kind of alluded to, that archive or that long-term retention has been that leading cause. Again, fairly low cost, fairly low risk. We're going to start to offload some of our local footprint and put this into cheap and deep storage from that cloud provider, but protecting endpoint and devices is a fairly new entrant to that category, as well as protecting SaaS applications. Again, these SaaS providers, such as a Microsoft Office 365, are providing you with certain levels of redundancy, fault tolerance, and availability, but the data and the intellectual property that's being created by the users within the SaaS environment is still the responsibility and the intellectual property of the organization that's subscribed to that service. So you're going to want to go beyond some of their native controls. The recycle bin is not an effective backup strategy for Office 365. So a couple of the newer entrants there, backing up PCs and other end-user devices, as well as SaaS applications, we are seeing great use for cloud backup, and that you can do so in a cloud-to-cloud way. I would at this point here like to just open up a quick poll here, and again, with this being the first of our two-part series, would really like to see if our audience is kind of jiving with some of this industry research. So if you take a moment here, would really appreciate your responses. This is a multiple choice question, so for folks that are willing to let us know, we'd be curious, are you using the cloud today as part of your data protection strategy? And you can indicate as many as you'd like. I'll leave this poll open for the next 45 seconds or so. And again, we'll take a look more closely at some of the findings here in our Part 2 follow-up. So we'll give folks just a moment here, and we'll be back momentarily here. Thank you. All right, fantastic. Thank you, everyone that had participated. There's going to be about another 20 seconds or so in which you can still submit responses. But right now, the leader, as far as folks that have joined us today, about 20% of our attendees are not using the cloud today as part of their strategy, but do plan to add some degree of cloud backup in the next 12 months. About 15% of users are already leveraging the cloud for that long-term archiving. About 7% of folks are using it for that more short-term storage, and about 4% each are leveraging disaster recovery as a service, are leveraging direct-to-cloud for their PCs and their endpoints, and another 4% that are backing up those SaaS applications. About 7% of organizations here with us today did report that they do not have interest in using the cloud today. So I am curious why that might be. And I am wondering if some of these objections that we've seen jive with some of the objections, that you have internally, or some of the things that you're kind of considering or aren't quite sure about. Cost primarily is the #1 reason that is cited, and it's still the leader in the clubhouse here. A lot of the information that's available around these cloud providers, around security, data privacy, have really lessened a lot of those concerns. We really saw security and data privacy being cited back in 2016 when there was a lot less information about the cloud readily available. There are some organizations that, of course, cannot shift to cloud for legal requirements, and others, too, that fear that loss of control or don't want to outsource mission-critical systems or key components of their infrastructure. We certainly understand some of the reticence there. With that in mind, we do have tools available on unitrends.com. As I had mentioned earlier during our introduction slide, Unitrends does provide a cloud service, both for long-term data retention and for disaster recovery as a service. We're a little bit different than the public cloud providers in that there are no egress fees with Unitrends, and we manage all of that back-end environment for you. So we're sizing out based on capacity and retention. As data continues to accumulate within AWS, you're going to start to see that footprint snowball when it comes to the overall cost of storage being used. But where storage really starts to accumulate, or where costs really start to accumulate, is when you start getting into those retrieval fees, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on here. But leveraging or recognizing that cloud storage is a major trend and something that folks are adopting, I wanted to pull some numbers here to kind of look into that. And for organizations that are using the cloud, and again, similar to our results here, where the majority of respondents were leveraging the cloud for archive, we've seen that again here through the Unitrends Cloud Survey, that data storage, that cold storage, long-term retention, still the leading use case, again, thinking cheap and deep storage. And again, folks that are using the cloud for archive has more than doubled over the last couple of years, but these numbers are speaking kind of similarly, so I'm going to keep kind of moving here. And this here is the key. In a lot of cases, as we had mentioned, that charge or the bills from a public cloud provider only really start to grow when you are making retrievals, and that's a reality. For organizations that are leveraging the cloud for storage, 3 out of 5 had to perform a restore within the last year, and the majority of those, 62%, had to perform that recovery. Almost 10% of folks were recovering 5 or more times, and again, that's where the cost really starts to accumulate. With the Unitrends Cloud, there are no egress fees, but even in scoping out Azure Cloud, this screenshot here that just popped up is their calculator estimate for leveraging their S3, their simple storage service. And even for any of those tiers, the data that's being returned, the percentage of storage not being accessed, are all key components in estimating what that monthly bill will be. It can become impossible to know. Disasters don't call ahead, so I think that from our perspective, this can be one of those gotchas with a lot of that public cloud infrastructure when you are getting dinged for accessing storage that the cloud provider will charge you for. Even though it's your data and you're leveraging that service, they're still going to have that cost ultimately to bring that data back or egress that data out of their cloud environment. Excuse me here. in addition to some of the challenges that we have seen from budgetary or personnel standpoints, the amount of data and the volumes of data that folks are protecting here has nearly tripled over the last 3 years. We're seeing data volumes continue to grow exponentially. We're very, very close again to a tipping point where more data is going to be created outside of the traditional data center than inside of it with an increasingly distributed mobile workforce. But in essence, those volumes are growing exponentially. Are you under kind of an avalanche of data yourself? It might be a familiar scenario for a lot of folks here. So with cloud being adopted, data volumes growing, in addition to that cloud storage piece, disaster recovery as a service is also a really popular offering. From the Cloud Endure survey, which we had mentioned earlier, since 2016, disaster recovery as a service was their fastest growing category, a 250% increase in organizations that had outsourced that DR as a service. Traditional provider could be an Iron Mountain or a SunGuard, self-maintained, again, that co-location site, and even a small percentage of folks that do not have a DR solution today. And we'll keep our fingers crossed for that small 6% here. But we have seen an increase in usage in the cloud for DRaaS, and again, it's a strategy that respondents indicate they are investing or investigating for future use. There are a tremendous amount of benefits, and when you think about the value of that DR as a service technology, from a maintenance standpoint, you can eliminate the need for a co-location, the associated power and cooling costs, maintaining that failover equipment or that hot target host that you'd be failing over to, keeping software and patches up to date on those systems. With DR as a service, the back-end infrastructure and environment is all being managed by that service provider. They've got redundancy, availability in place. Hopefully they've scripted through and prepared the site so that they are ready to receive that phone call. There's a tremendous amount of lifting or heavy lifting that goes into preparing for the DR event so that when they receive that phone call and that declaration, the failover process goes smoothly. We are seeing traditionally enterprises are adopting DR as a service at a higher rate than SMBs, and this could be to a number of factors: the cost, the overall complexity, and having a dedicated team to build out a cloud or DR environment. For some providers, or if you're a kind of that multifunction IT user where you're wearing a lot of different hats, it may not always be feasible to scope out public cloud infrastructure to deploy or stand up a DR site within an AWS. That could be somewhere where a provider or a dedicated service provider could help. Again, services are being more widely understood. We're seeing more small and mid-sized organizations start to pick up and adopt DRaaS. When we talk about leveraging that service, this is just one example and kind of a snapshot of what the Unitrends DR as a service affords or provides our customers. It's going to start with an onboarding or a consulting engagement with our Cloud Cores team to identify recovery point and recovery time objectives, DR response requirements, identifying protected systems and networking configurations. We can seed that data so that we're not having to try and transmit terabytes and terabytes over the WAN, but orchestration of what that failover needs to look like is a key part of our onboarding process, defining the boot order dependencies of your machines, setting up the cloud stack's network configuration to mirror the production environment, configuring firewall rules and settings, the provisioning of public-facing IPs should you need to host a website. All of those things are taken into consideration so that when you do make that phone call, it's fully hands-off. You've made that declaration. We're going to issue that IPsec tunnel once the DR site is available to help you reroute all of that user traffic, but standing up the DR infrastructure, there's no burden on our end users. We're performing that for them. We run regular tests against the environment, application level scripts to verify the integrity of the data, and report back to our users regularly so that we have confidence and you have that proof that we're able to meet the RTOs with which you've been promised. And this stat, I think, was really an interesting one, because something that we hear a lot about our DR as a service is, well, Unitrends, it sounds pretty cool, it sounds pretty nice, but has anyone ever had to use it? And for the majority of folks, they have failed over, and 93% of folks that did fail over within the last year reported an acceptable performance. We were able to meet the RTOs, the RPO requirements, the applications were working, we were able to recover everything. I think that successful performance, again, is a testament to the onboarding and services practices that we're conducting upon initiation of that service, or enrolling our customers into that service. We're vetting the cloud stack and the cloud environment fully, testing it down to the application level, and reporting back to you again so that we have that visibility and that confidence. For folks that found that performance wasn't acceptable, did your provider kind of map through all of those key pieces, the boot order dependencies for end-tier applications, networking configurations, and so forth, so that they were fully ready? Did they also guarantee you certain RPOs or RTOs as part of their SLA, all things that you should be asking and learning about from your service provider to understand exactly what you should expect? And again here, knowing that folks have failed over and that they've had a successful experience, I think, is key. And one such customer of ours is based down in the Lakeland, Florida area, Safety Products. They operate 2 sites in the southeastern United States. They're producing safety equipment for use in contracting, public works, construction, and so forth. Before leveraging Unitrends, they were trying to leverage a hardware provider and some native VMware replication, but they could never quite get replication between the 2 sites to work. They had 3 key environments across physical Windows, Linux, and some virtualized window machines that they needed to protect. They opted to deploy Unitrends virtual appliances for backup, leveraged existing compute and storage resources, as well as replicate to the cloud for long-term retention, and enroll mission-critical machines, including their ERP application, in our disaster recovery as a service. After deploying Unitrends, the following year, in 2017, they were tracking Hurricane Irma as it had ravaged Barbados and was Bermuda, and was making its way up the Atlantic. They realized that their Lakeland, Florida location was directly in the storm's path. So 5 days before making landfall, their CTO, Dennis Hershey, called our support center and declared a disaster. We initiated the failover and the spin-up of those mission-critical applications. He got employees routed to that secondary location, or to a safe location outside of the Lakeland area where the storm was expected to do the most damage, and they still had access to the data and the information systems from that Lakeland office while the primary site was unavailable. When the storm had passed through and they were ready to fail back to the local site, we provided them with a reverse seated appliance to help re-import and rebuild any systems that were damaged or lost during the storm's incident, synced them up with last changes from the DR site, and helped them fail back operations. These folks also declared again in 2019, with Hurricane Dorian passing through, making a similar path here, but you can read more about Safety Products experience on unitrends.com, another great case study from one of our providers. Now, one of the top challenges around that DR as a service comes with the recovery time, and that's again where you should be asking the provider what measures they have in place, and are there guarantees as part of your SLA as far as the RTO. Now, with the Unitrends service, we do provide contractually guaranteed RTO SLAs based on different levels or RTOs desired. We offer a 1-hour, a 24-hour, and a best effort level of the service, so you can mix and match and design really the ideal or customized DR response and requirements for your organization or unique needs. So from a recovery time perspective, we are providing those at a contractually guaranteed rate, and testing against them regularly to ensure that we are in compliance. Some of the other concerns here, while less frequently cited, a lack of cloud skills or interoperability, that's part of the benefits of leveraging a third-party service provider, where all of that back-end infrastructure is being maintained and managed by those cloud experts. We have teams that are staffed 24/7 by 365, whose sole responsibility is maintenance and operation of that DR or that cloud environment. I think that in some cases when folks are trying to stand things up at a co-location or a private cloud, leveraging failover into a public cloud environment, or where those concerns more heavily arise. And the last piece on cost, again, with different tiers of the Unitrend service, you can find and kind of mix and match the right RTO SLAs to find that right balance of response time and cost for your organization. But it's certainly, you want to take into account here as well, not just that upfront bill, but what also is your organization going to save from a time perspective, from a secondary site perspective, a lease potentially on a co-location, additional hardware, power and cooling costs, etc. So we've got some different tools, and our experts would be more than happy to kind of sit down and help folks really kind of build that TCO story when it comes to leveraging a manufacturer's environment for DR as a service versus an alternative avenue. The ability to test, again, frequently is important. Similar to testing backups, being able to test that recovery site for any of the aforementioned challenges or problems is important. The majority of respondents are testing at least once a year. Even better are the folks that are testing quarterly or monthly here. Unable to test your DR capabilities, I think that, again, you run into some of those same challenges. And, you know, is the networking going to work? Are the dependencies between machines, are they able to connect as we're spinning them up? Did we apply a patch here that potentially is broken? That communication between clients here. You want to be testing regularly, especially when any changes are made to patches, versioning, or updates. And if you're not testing, you don't really know what issues or hurdles you may encounter. You're dealing with those challenges on top of whatever emergency has forced you into failing over. So again, when we look at who's providing those DR services, responses to the Unitrends Cloud jive with some of those results from that Cloud Indoor survey, again, where AWS was the leader in the leader in the clubhouse. Managing DR, still that top response. Outsourcing to a third party, such as a Unitrends, kind of that second tier of response. In a lot of cases, on the smaller side, SMBs, again, that lack the internal teams, they don't have a dedicated team for DR or for backup, are outsourcing to an MSP or a value-added reseller or a service provider to lean on their expertise. As always, we're seeing faster recoveries with that DR as a service versus without DRAS. The number of organizations that was able to recover in an hour or less was nearly double those that could not with that DR as a service. And again, a part of that testing, the guaranteed SLAs, go into ensuring that that failover is going to be a successful experience. We want to make that data available to you as quickly as possible and maintain operations while that primary site is unavailable. It's also helped organizations shore up the instances of downtime. 50% fewer organizations have experienced downtime than those that did use DRAS. There still may be some delay, no failover, may be instantaneous, but when we think about the cost of downtime and kind of correlating here and being able to recover very, very quickly, the faster you're able to recover, typically the less of an impact there's going to be on the organization from a budgetary standpoint or a productivity standpoint. We're able to increase and shorten up the RTOs as well. We talked a little bit about those contractually guaranteed RTOs with Unitrends. We're going to explore that service in a little bit more detail next week here. So with about 5 minutes to go, I do want to open things up to the Q&A, but would be curious, again, from our audience here, where do you all stand when it comes to leveraging DR as a service? Would love to open this poll up here, and I'll let this run for just a few minutes here. In the meantime, I'm actually just going to take down my screen for a moment here and pop in a couple of those case studies that I mentioned. So I'm going to put those into the chat, Xscale Engineering and Safety Products. If you'd like to check out those stories here, those two customer case studies that we referenced, I'm going to pop those in the chat here while folks take a moment to respond to the survey. All right, excellent. So those links are in the chat here again. Thank you, everyone. It looks like I'll leave this open for just another moment here. But the majority of folks, about a quarter of all folks here today, are not using DR as a service today, but are interested in potentially leveraging that service. About 10% of folks are planning to add DR as a service in the next 12 months. For the folks that are using Unitrends DRAS, thank you. We appreciate your continued support and our continued partnership. Again, our customers are the forefront and the lifeblood of everything that we do, so we thank you. And about 10% of folks, respectively, that are leveraging public cloud providers or have outsourced it to a third party. So a lot of folks here that are using DR as a service. About 40% of our respondents here are using DR as a service in one way or another, or are planning to leverage it. About 5 folks out there are not interested in DR as a service, and we certainly recommend, or recognize, excuse me, that it may not be the right solution or the best fit for every customer or every environment here. So I'm going to close this one out here, and I do have one last poll while we answer the Q&A. If you'd like to discuss your needs, the Unitrends Cloud, Unitrends solution, any questions around backup, business continuity, DR, with the Unitrends representative, please feel free to let us know. You can just chat in or indicate here, and if you'd like someone to reach out, we'd be happy to send those out to everyone, and if not at this time, we really appreciate you joining. Hopefully came away with some food for thought, and we hope to see you next week when we drill down into how Unitrends solution is kind of in line with some of these trends and some of the things that we can do to help support our customers in preparing for protecting their environments in 2020 and beyond. So while this is up here, I'm going to pop into the Q&A here, so please do feel free to chat any last-minute questions that you had here. Really appreciate everyone who was able to come out. You're very welcome for sharing the links here. I've got a few more that I'll put into the chat here in just a moment. I do have a question from Chris, and Chris is wondering, from a security or compliance perspective, is the disk drive on a Unitrends appliance encrypted when swapped out for replacement? So Chris, within the Unitrends appliance, you can opt on an asset-to-asset basis what the encryption would be. So Unitrends is equipped with an encryption algorithm, AES 256-bit. Any data that's being archived to an external drive can be encrypted. Any data that is residing on the Unitrends appliance is encrypted both in flight and at rest. So if we are swapping out a replacement hard drive for you, when you're removing that hard drive, the data is going to be encrypted at AES 256-bit on those drives. In addition, when feeding data to the Unitrends cloud, we will ship either a NAS device or another storage device to feed larger amounts of data, and that data can be encrypted in flight and at rest as well. So we are encrypting all data that's residing on the appliance AES 256-bit, and any drives that are being removed from the appliance would have that data encrypted. Somebody here, so Nick, where you had issue accessing those links, I'll follow up and send these to you in an email here, and I'm just going to see if we had any other Q&A here that had come in. A lot of folks saying hello from California, hello from Ontario. So everyone, thank you so much, really appreciate it here. Yes, so it looks like some requests for the slides here. We do have a question from Shinny. Would it be possible to host Workspace, Cloud UI, and Control Center by ourselves? And in that one, Shinny, with regards to that, I'm going to have to do a little bit more research specifically into that particular application or UI. I'm not certain I understand what it is that you would be hosting here. Jositha is wondering, how secure is our data in the cloud? So, Jositha, that will vary by cloud provider. From the Unitrends cloud standpoint, we are meeting a lot of those industry audits or industry regulations. We're operating Tier 3 SSA 18 certified data centers. They have passed the audit for SOC 2 Type 2 compliance. We maintain controls around CGIS, HIPAA, GDPR, PCI data. So we are meeting or exceeding a number of the compliance standards or industry mandates as far as the data that's being secured in the Unitrends cloud. And all data will be encrypted AES-256-bit in flight and at rest. Sampath is wondering, do you perform regular backups, and how fast can you perform a restore when needed? And Sampath, that will depend in some cases on what it is that we are backing up. From a scheduling perspective, you can schedule backups with your Unitrends appliance in one of two ways: on a schedule basis or by creating an SLA policy. The SLA policy, in essence, you'd be grouping machines, such as virtual machines, physical servers, etc., into a policy where they would be defined by the backup frequency or the RPO. So you could set an interval as short as every 5 minutes, and if you're protecting those virtual machines, for example, a snapshot would be created every 5 minutes. Where more granularity may be required, if you're looking to protect a SQL database with our application agent, truncate transaction logs, take differential backups, take a full backup on Sundays, you can schedule out more detailed scheduling operations, but you can perform backups in essence really as frequently as necessary. Certainly would recommend you back things up regularly. And from a restore ability, we do have some instant recovery capabilities around Windows machines, virtual machines with VMware and Hyper-V for near zero RTOs. You can create replicas of mission critical clients in advance of needing them. It's essentially a standby up-to-date copy of that asset that's kept current with every backup as those are applied, and it's ready to go live at the moment's notice. Granular recovery, such as recovering files or folders. We've got a search file function, should be able to pull back an individual or a deleted item in just a couple of minutes. So I know there are a lot of different options, but hopefully that kind of answered your question and gave you an idea of some of the capabilities here. So Chinny, in asking, how do I know that my data can't be accessed by other customers? Some of those security controls around the PCI audit, for example, maintaining the privacy of that, credit card data, credit card holder data, that CHD, those controls would be put in place by the cloud provider. So again, you'd want to really audit a lot of their controls, regulations, security policies to ensure that the environment is secure in that standpoint. But I think that a lot of clouds, whether it be documentation through their SOC audit or other testing or audits they've undergone would have that information available. So there are a lot of so it looks like, unfortunately, as we've gone a little bit over, that is all of the time that we have for questions today. So I'm just going to pull my screen down again. I am going to put a couple of links here last minute into the chat here. So there are going to be some links here if you'd like to try out Unitrends backup software, keep an eye on future events, or get in touch with a member of our sales organization. Please do feel free to capture information from the links here. For folks requesting a copy of the presentation, additional links, I will follow up, and as well, if there are any questions that we were unable to get to, a representative will follow up with you to address those in more detail. I apologize that we ran a little bit over. But again, want to thank everyone for joining us here. Once we have the full reports from WebEx, we will be entering again all of those attendees into our raffle for $500 Amazon gift card. We have 5 prizes of $100 each that will be awarded to 5 of our lucky attendees today. Thank you very much again for your time and joining us here. We hope to see you next week on the conclusion of our summary of data protection and trends in 2019, as well as our last $500 tech demo giveaway for 2019. So at this point here, I want to wish everyone a great rest of their day, a great afternoon ahead. We hope to see you next week, and thanks again for joining. My name is Adam Margette, Technical Specialist with Unitrends, signing off here. Thank you so much.